action. These charges come just 3 days before President Trump's scheduled one-on-one meeting with Putin in Finland. Tonight, the White House says that meeting still on. Now, here is the first thing to know about this indictment. It is exhaustive. Mueller making the case against Putin's agents with far more detail than would be legally required. Over 29 pages of meticulous detail, Mueller showing how these 12 Russian military intelligence operatives allegedly worked to impact the election. These are not random hackers or the proverbial 400-pound guy sitting on his bed. These are Putin government officials hacking their way through our political system, targeting not only Clinton aides, but we're learning here from today's indictment, targeting entities opposed to Trump in 2016, which includes the Democrats' National Party and their congressional election shop, and then leaking that stolen material through fictitious online personas, including DC Leaks and Guccifer 2.0. Now, right there, those entities are obviously quite important, because Mueller's not just indicting Russians with this filing today. He's using what is a historic indictment to reveal how Russia's strategy works, which might help inoculate some Americans against the next cyber strike whenever it may come. And Mueller is showing this was not just about stealing emails. It was about deceiving the American public. We can think of it as a kind of information laundering, because long before Trump was playing down the Russia threat, these Russian agents knew direct leaking of material against Clinton could be less effective. So Mueller shows today that material was presented as the product of these independent hackers or released through Organization One. That's a description that matches WikiLeaks, and then timed to damage Clinton at the most pivotal period, her nomination at the Democratic Convention. Now, today, Mueller's boss calling for nonpartisanship in announcing these charges, a marked contrast to the GOP's partisan attacks on that FBI official just yesterday at that contentious House hearing.
The blame for election interference belongs to the criminals who committed election interference. We need to work together to hold the perpetrators accountable. It's important for us to avoid thinking politically as Republicans or Democrats, and instead to think patriotically as Americans. Our response must not depend on which side was victimized.
There's a lot more in here. These new charges show how far this went beyond email in the indictment. Mueller laying out in detail how the Russian military intelligence officers used all kinds of sophisticated tactics, including spear phishing, to implant something called malware, which is what Russian agents use to create a kind of surveillance-style tool, which allows them to actually track operatives, in this case, people who were working inside the DNC in real time. This is a big deal. It's sort of a keyboard equivalent of a foreign power's wiretap. And again, this was used for Russia's agenda to impact our election. Now, you know, it has become pretty common to ask if this scandal is worse than Watergate. In terms of size and duration, today, Mueller's indictment says yes, this wasn't some third-rate cyber burglary. This was a big, long-term operation from a nuclear-armed foreign adversary of the United States. So that's one way to answer the question. Now, in terms of whether there was top American involvement, Mueller's indictment does not answer that question of whether it was worse than Watergate in that sense in today's filing. We know that scandal toppled the presidency not only because of the crimes committed, but obviously because of who knew about them, the president. Now, today's indictment states that the Russian email hacking began the same day candidate Donald Trump asked for it, with Russian agents making their first attempt to access Clinton's personal emails on July 27, 2016. Now, that's not technical proof Trump knew about it when he asked, but it ain't helpful to him either. And then you have the suspicions that Americans have. Well, they don't stop there. Mueller noting an unnamed U.S. candidate for Congress asked the Russians for stolen documents, which they provided, and they gave stolen data to a state lobbyist, an online source of political news, seeming to confirm previous reports identifying a Republican consultant in Florida in that effort. And then this tantalizing sentence. Russian operatives talked about their stolen material with, quote, a person who was in regular contact with senior members of the presidential campaign of Donald J. Trump. Many pointing to Roger Stone tonight as that person. He is denying it. And the Americans impacted here also go far beyond those kind of political elites. In this filing, again, all this new stuff we're just getting into our newsroom and figuring out today, in this filing, Mueller says the Russians stole personal information for 500,000 Americans, reports identifying the source as the Illinois State Board of Elections. And this, of course, all comes at the moment when the president was having tea with Queen Elizabeth and 3 days before he's due to sit down with Vladimir Putin, a meeting that makes the Trump administration look far weaker, with the DOJ saying today that Donald Trump, he knew about these charges before we did, before the public did, before anyone heard about it when this filing came out from the grand jury today. He knew as of last week. Democrats saying Trump should cancel this meeting, top Republicans not joining that request as of this hour. The White House is full steam ahead. Now let's take it all in. We know Bob Mueller doesn't preview his moves, so nobody knows what he will precisely do next. But today's indictment, it doesn't read like a final chapter, given these references to an unnamed Trump associate, whoever that may be, and to anonymous other Americans mixed up in what is now a charged criminal international conspiracy. And if Mueller doesn't talk, some witnesses do. We were thinking back on this today. Previously, NBC News reported that witnesses were facing questions from Mueller's investigators over what Trump knew about hacked Democratic emails before they went public, and more seriously, whether he was involved in their, quote, strategic release. Russia launched this cyber attack on the U.S., and that has gone largely unpunished by the Trump administration. We know Trump was dragged to sanctions on Russia by Congress. Tonight, he is blatantly skipping any opportunity to take this announcement by his own Deputy Attorney General to stand tall and tough on the world stage. And let's be clear about how big this is. Tonight, we learned something no one knew in public yesterday, that it does look like the Russians were listening to Trump's hacking request on July 27th, 2016. Today, we learned they are charged with committing that requested crime that day. And so the questions that remain are significant, but far more narrow. Was that a coincidence? Some kind of overreaction to overheated candidate rhetoric? Or was it a key step advancing an international criminal conspiracy unfolding in plain sight? I'm joined now by Carol Lee, NBC's national political reporter, who, along with our colleague Katie Tour, broke that exclusive story I just mentioned about those questions that witnesses were being asked by Mueller investigators in February, which feels very pertinent tonight. Carol, thank you for your reporting. Thank you for joining us. When we look at that line of questioning, what does that tell you about how early Mueller was reviewing this issue and what it means in today's indictment?
Well, if you look at what we reported in February, there were a number of things in that story, but two of them stick out pretty significantly now in light of this indictment. And the first is this July 27, 2016 comment that now President Trump made that you just referenced, that Russia, if you're listening, can you find Hillary Clinton's missing 30,000 emails? We reported at the time in February that witnesses were being asked whether somebody outside of the Trump campaign had directed then candidate Trump to say that. Now we know that day is quite significant in that it was the first time that Russia seems to have actually tried to go and do what Donald Trump suggested Russia do. The second piece that sticks out is Roger Stone. In our story in February, we talked about two witnesses who said that they were being asked a lot of questions about Roger Stone, and not just Roger Stone in terms of his contacts with WikiLeaks and whether he met with Julian Assange and questions like that, but about the nature of his relationship with then candidate Trump. How close were they? Under what circumstances did he leave the Trump campaign? How often did they still talk? And so there was this, what looked to be some sort of effort to either try to make some sort of connection or probe whether there was some sort of connection between these two things. And I think that now, looking at this indictment, the question that hangs over this is whether there was something to the July 27th comments that the candidate Trump made, and B, if there's something more to Roger Stone's role, because we now know in the indictment that he is believed to be the unnamed person with contacts to senior members of the Trump campaign who was also in contact with Russian hackers. And then if those two things merge in some way, and I think you're absolutely correct in that this indictment seems to be the next step to getting closer to the question that is really the biggest one hanging over all of this, which is there any American, anyone involved with the Trump campaign or associated with President Trump who was knowingly colluding with the Russians?
So when you refer to whether Trump was encouraged to ask this, you're saying that Mueller may be investigating whether someone who knew more and thus would have more criminal culpability basically intimated to Donald Trump he could get more out of Russia if he would just open these floodgates on July 27th?
Right, that's one possibility. I mean, I think that we, like a lot of times in these sorts of stories covering the Mueller investigation, there's just a lot more questions than there are answers. That's definitely one possibility, that they were trying to figure out if there was some effort to use President then candidate Trump as a vessel in some way, whether it was asking him to or advising him to say something publicly that somebody wanted him to say, and then there's a question of, did he know something? We just don't know the answer to that question. The other thing we reported in our story in February is that in that same news conference, President Trump talked about lifting sanctions against Russia and also suggested, accepting Russia's annexation of Crimea. And those were questions that Robert Mueller's team was also asking witnesses about, who advised him to do that. So there's clearly this very, very strong interest in the people around the president and why the president was saying things that we all saw him say during the campaign in public.
Carol Lee from NBC News, thank you so much for sharing more of your reporting.
Thanks, Ari.
I want to turn now to David Criss, former Assistant Attorney General for National Security for the Justice Department. What do you see as most important in this indictment, and why, in your view, does it say more than it has to?
Yeah, well, it's a major missing piece of Mueller's mosaic of charges, this indictment. Previously, we'd seen indictments relating to propaganda efforts and the offering and exchange of things of value, and of course a good deal of concealment and lying. But until today, we hadn't seen any charges on hacking of the DNC and the Clinton campaign, and that was a major part of the Russian election interference efforts. So this sort of rounds out Mueller's accounting of the Russian efforts to influence our election in 2016.
And is he saying more, you think, for a legal strategy, or why?
Well, I think that this indictment is what prosecutors would call a speaking indictment. It tells a compelling story, a narrative of the events that it describes and in relation to the charges that it brings. It does for the hacking, I think, a little bit what the previous indictment of the Internet Research Agency did for the propaganda elements of the Russian campaign. That is, it takes information that we knew in some sense from the intelligence community's assessment that was released in January 2017, but it presents it in a rich, compelling narrative with a clear story and plenty of detail that helps people understand exactly what was going on, and I think it's valuable in part for that reason.
We hear a lot about the DOJ's independence. The National Security Division, which is where you previously worked, is one area that intersects more deliberately with other parts of the government, because some things relate to the CIA, the Pentagon, and other decisions to be made. That's why Rosenstein made it very clear that the president was advance warned on this as far back as last week. Walk us through how something like today's indictment overlaps with the rest of the national security apparatus of the United States. And are there ever cases you've been in where you see, yes, oh, we found something bad, but it traces back to a major nuclear adversary? Are we sure we want to deal with this in the courts to begin with?
People complain about Trump being in Britain.
So one of the most challenging elements in an indictment like this one is the fact that a good deal of the information the government has in its possession will have been obtained from sensitive intelligence sources and methods. And there is always a robust interagency debate about how, if at all, we can bring charges that will make the criminal case in a compelling way, but without risking undue disclosure and compromise of sources and methods. And I am sure that such a debate occurred in this case. And then, of course, there's the ultimate decision about whether criminal prosecution is the right tool for the particular problem that we're addressing. Often it is.
Before I let you go, I have to ask you the other question on the minds of many people, I think some of our viewers, based on what I understand. Do you view the way this indictment is written as the last chapter, the last indictment in this case, or a preview of more to come?
Oh, I do not think it is the last chapter at all. I think it is, what Mueller is doing here is following standard procedure, which is in these kinds of complex investigations to start with the outer ring, the low-hanging fruit, the readily provable stuff, and then work your way in towards the bullseye. So I'm willing to bet that President Trump and his closest associates right now are and probably should be worried that depending on what the evidence is, in the next round of activity, the walls may feel like they're closing in.
Well, David, I know you to be a careful prosecutor and speaker, so that is particularly notable coming from you with the caveats that I know you would bring to any forward-looking statement, but the notion of the walls closing in and there being other indictments, certainly something on many people's minds and maybe many people inside the White House. David Criss, former Assistant Attorney General for National Security, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you.
What we're going to do is fit in a short break, but we have much more on these charges today ahead, including the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee will join us here live. We also have live reporting from Richard Engel, who you saw at the top of the hour, from the UK with questions about Russia's interference and how they've followed the president. We'll be right back.
Mr. President, will you tell Putin to stay out of U.S. elections?
Yes. Tonight, we are all still processing and learning a lot more about this Bob Mueller indictment against 12 Russian agents over hacking into the Democratic Party, plus Hillary Clinton's campaign emails, and disseminating that hacked information all at the most pivotal times in the general election of the 2016 campaign. Now, as promised, we turn to the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Adam Schiff, who's been leading his own parallel investigation into all this. Thank you for joining us on this busy evening, Congressman. When you look at what is alleged in this new indictment, do you think these Russian agents could have pulled all of it off alone?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, certainly there's plenty of evidence that there were communications with Americans, and we knew this before the indictment. One of the things that's not even mentioned in this indictment is the fact that the Russians told the Trump campaign, through George Papadopoulos, we know, and perhaps through others, that they were in possession of these very same stolen documents that are laid out in the indictment. That happened in April. We know from this indictment that it was just the month before that they did the hacking. So almost immediately thereafter, they're telling the Trump campaign, we have this. And as you pointed out earlier on the show, when the president goes out in July and says, hey, Russians, if you're listening, these are some other emails we're interested in your hacking, they go out and attempt to hack those too. And I think it's very significant, not just that Bob Mueller puts the date, July 27th, in the indictment, but even the time. They want us to know that this happened after Donald Trump made that speech. And I think that's a pretty significant tell as well.
So we're lucky to have you, given your mastery of the timeline. Viewers hearing you may think, okay, well, if they already had stuff in April, which they were sharing, and at least information about that, what exactly was different about what they were pursuing in July?
Well, what we've seen is there were hacks of a number of different democratic institutions, and there was also a lot of thought and care put into what is the best timeline to start releasing this material. One of the other interesting aspects, again, when you put this indictment together with what we know from the investigation and what we know from some of the other plea documents, is you have that June 9th meeting in Trump Tower, where the Trump campaign at the highest levels has offered derogatory information on Hillary Clinton. The message that goes back to the Kremlin is, we'd love to have your help, but we're really disappointed in what you produced at that meeting. Now, it's only days later that Julian Assange, who is, of course, heading that other unnamed organization in the indictment, announces he's received the Russian emails, or the stolen emails from the Russians. He doesn't mention the Russians per se, but we know that's where they came from. And we also see a suggestion by Don Jr. that the best time they could use the help is late summer. And of course, we see that's what the Russians do. They start dribbling these out in late summer to maximal effect.
So you're laying out a rather subtle approach to conspiracy or collusion, to use the more colloquial term, which is the notion that there's some sort of menu and the Russians are offering all kinds of things, and they're getting relatively high-level access to the Trump campaign, saying, well, we're cooler to this and we're warmer to that, and also here's the time that it would be most helpful. Based on your knowledge, as well as whatever you can glean and share from your own investigation, does that rise to the level of criminal intent, or at the end of the day, is that the Russians doing what many people know they've done, which is throw a lot of stuff at the United States with or without American encouragement?
What we see is really classic Russian tradecraft, and that is they'll make outreaches to people, to Americans. They'll begin by using intermediaries. They'll then see whether there's a receptivity to the approach, and if there is, they'll follow it up with other approaches. And this is the pattern we see with the approach through the professor to Papadopoulos, then the approach through the foreign ministry, then the approach through the meeting at Trump Tower. And you see that they're getting the message effectively back from the Trump campaign. Yes, we are receptive to this. In fact, the president himself, as candidate, says quite publicly that he wants the Russians to help by hacking, and you see the Russians come through. Now, whether there is sufficient proof of conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt involving the Trump campaign, Bob Mueller is in the best position to know. What I can see are different pieces of this puzzle. But what I can see also has missing pieces. I don't know, for example, who Papadopoulos talked to about the Russian approach. We were going to bring in John Mashburn, one of the policy advisors for the Trump campaign, this week. He'd agreed to come in, but as soon as we informed the majority he was going to come testify, the majority intervened to tell him not to come. The majority doesn't want to know who in the Trump campaign was aware of this approach and who might have been in the know prior to the meeting in Trump Tower. But Bob Mueller knows at this point, and we'll just have to wait to see whether the next indictment on the hacking and dumping operation, if there is another, is focused on Americans.
As you say, Bob Mueller knows, Donald Trump knew for some time here with advance warning, and what your colleagues yesterday in that rather contentious hearing knew, I think, is also an open question, given just how ferocious some of the political pushback has been. Congressman Schiff, top Democrat on House Intelligence, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Much appreciated. Now, we have a lot more tonight on the blockbuster indictments, as well as an exclusive look at some new and big questions about the financing of Donald Trump's Scottish golf courses. Please stay with us.
The Justice Department said today the president had been briefed about the pending charges earlier this week. Yet today, at a press conference with the British Prime Minister, the president once again called the Russia investigation a witch hunt. And despite the criminal charges against Russian intelligence officers, the president still plans to go to Helsinki on Monday to meet with Vladimir Putin. This is the culmination of a European tour that has bruised, battered, and tested our relationships. The president, it seems, likes to keep our enemies close and throw our allies under the bus. Today, it was Theresa May's turn under the wheels. Britain woke up today to an interview President Trump gave to a leading tabloid. In it, he criticized May's negotiating skills, threatened another trade war, and endorsed her worst political enemy. It was so bad that today, the president tried to take it all back.
They put on a united front for the cameras, but the meeting with the British Prime Minister today began with a rare thing from the president, an apology.
When I saw her this morning, I said, I want to apologize because I said such good things about you. She said, don't worry, it's only the press.
That's one thing it seems they can agree on. It's all the press's fault.
It's called fake news. You know, we solve a lot of problems with the good old recording instrument.
Theresa May was, well, very British about it all.
And as you've heard from the President, the United States is keen for us. We're keen to work with them. And we will do a trade deal with them and with others around the rest of the world.
But there's a reason why they were standing at the Prime Minister's country retreat and not in London. Because this is what the people of this country had to say.
Donald Trump, go away!
They mocked him. They ridiculed him. They knocked him down.
This protest feels very personal. People here tell us they're offended not just by the president's policies, but by his words. Not just by what he's doing, but who he is.
I hate him. I hate this man. I hate everything he does and everything he stands for.
He should not mess with London.
Trump's a twat. They called it a carnival of resistance. It was an enormous march. Organizers claimed 250,000 people turned up, many fueled by the perception that their prime minister was appeasing a bully.
I think what a humiliation for Theresa May to suck up to Donald Trump, offer him that state visit, hold his hands, refuse to offer moral leadership in condemning his policies, and then what does he do? Lands and humiliates his hosts, intervenes in British politics.
President Trump is deeply unpopular here. A recent poll found that just 11% of people in Britain think he's doing a good job. The other 89% made their voices and their horns heard. But the president was hearing another tune altogether. He was getting the tour that American tourists dream of, his very own changing of the guard, and a personal welcome from the Queen of England. There were a few awkward moments, of course, but he did get the royal treatment that he came for.
They'll lay on the full Monty. They'll give the whole thing, or we call New York, the whole schmaltz will be laid out for him, and he wants it. He wants it.
Bonnie Greer, a playwright originally from Chicago, moved here more than 20 years ago.
He'll be grinning from ear to ear, and he'll have a big picture that he can take back to Mar-a-Lago. That's what he wants. That's what they'll give him.
The Queen, of course, doesn't get to choose who drops in for tea at Windsor Castle. That decision was made by another extra in the Trump reality show, Theresa May.
I would give our relationship with the UK, and now, especially after this 2 days, with your Prime Minister, I would say the highest level of special. Now, am I allowed to go higher than that? I'm not sure. But it's the highest level of special.
But there was another relationship that journalists here wanted to know about.
Now your British trip is coming to a close. Could you tell us the 3 or 4 things you hope to achieve in your meeting with Vladimir Putin?
The president had a whole shopping list of things, from Ukraine to Syria to nuclear weapons. Eventually, he remembered one more.
I know you'll ask, will we be talking about meddling? And I will absolutely bring that up. I don't think you'll have any, gee, I did it, you got me. There won't be a Perry Mason here, I don't think, but you never know what happens, right? But I will absolutely, firmly ask the question.
I'm sure you fucking won't, dick. Anyway, so that's fucking...
Despite strong opposition from several Democrats, the president is still planning to meet with Vladimir Putin, but not right away. Putin, you see, is busy Sunday night hosting the finals of the Soccer World Cup. So President Trump has to wait. And as we saw, London is out of the question, so he hopped on Air Force One and went to Scotland to spend the weekend at a golf resort, one of 3 that he owns on this side of the pond. We have also been spending time in Scotland lately investigating the finances of those golf resorts. What we discovered is numbers that simply don't add up. A presidential visit is a great way to promote a golf resort, and it doesn't hurt when the president is also the owner.
It's reasonable to say he's getting a publicity value 100 times over what the cost is of him visiting these properties.
Robert Weissman is the director of Public Citizen, a watchdog group which has often criticized the president.
So every time we, in the media, show President Trump with a Trump logo behind it, we're building his brand.
Absolutely, and he is completely aware of it, and he's turning the presidency into a great big branding exercise.
Based on the cost of past presidential trips, Weissman and his team have projected that this weekend could cost the taxpayer around $1.9 million, of which around $200,000 will be spent at Trump Turnberry.
If the Secret Service agent stays on his property or eats at his restaurant, that's a payment that's going to go to the Trump businesses.
And there are a whole lot of Secret Service agents in Turnberry right now.
This is a beautiful corner of Scotland, and you'd think, with President Trump serving as marketer-in-chief, a golf course here would be a money-making machine. But it turns out President Trump doesn't just come here to sink a few holes on these lush and manicured greens. He's sinking enormous amounts of money, which begs the question, why?
Public records show that the president paid more than $50 million for this property when he bought it in 2014, even though it was losing money. Since then, he spent another $85 million on renovations, but the resort continues to lose millions of dollars each year. Of all the luxuries the president enjoys, golf courses maybe the most expensive.
Now, nobody knew Trump could do that, right?
It's his escape. It's the place where he feels most at home, and he lets his guard down and reveals himself. So it's
American golf writer Alan Shipnuck has made national headlines with the things the president said on the golf course. He says the Trump you get on the green,
well, we'll do our best, huh?
is the same Trump you get in the White House.
Well, it sounded good.
I've never seen anyone drive a golf cart where Donald Trump drives his golf carts. I mean, he's driving on the greens, he's driving on the tee boxes. It's just not done, but he gets away with it because they're Trump courses.
Because if you're king of the castle, you get to, do what you want.
Ownership has its privileges, but it's definitely
You think
not.
that's why he wants to own these places? So that he can do things like that?
Of course. I mean, that's a big part of it. He gets to reshape them in his own image. You know, whether it's the gold faucets or it's the tacky waterfalls or it's the ability to break all the rules.
The president owns a total of 3 golf courses on this side of the ocean, 2 in Scotland and 1 in Ireland. In Scotland and Ireland, private companies have to file detailed annual financial reports, which are then made publicly available. That's why we know more about the president's businesses here than anywhere else. All 3 courses are losing money, and the president is still more than $200 million in the hole from them.
They've just become these sinkholes of money. Spent so much money to build the courses, and in the case of Turnberry, to renovate this huge old hotel and to build these new holes, and he's not getting it back.
Why would he keep putting money into losing investments?
It's one of the great mysteries of the golf world. You know, what was Trump thinking? You know, I'm not a hotelier, I'm not a real estate developer, but when you just look at the numbers, it doesn't really add up.
To try to make sense of those numbers, we tracked down Neil Hobday. These days, he runs a posh polo club, but starting in 2006, he was the project manager for Trump's first golf investment in Scotland.
He invested a lot of money, but he didn't ask anyone else to partner him, and it was all his own money.
And that was all cash?
Yeah, he paid, you know, asking price, he paid for it. Then my first 3 paychecks, if you like, were not wired to my bank, but were checks signed personally by Donald Trump.
Did that surprise you? Did that surprise other people in the organization?
This was very unusual, and they told me that. They said, you know, he doesn't really do this often.
To say that as a real estate developer, Donald Trump didn't often pay cash is a major understatement. He built an empire with other people's money, and he was proud of it.
I'm the king of debt. I'm great with debt. Nobody knows debt better than me. I've made a fortune by using debt.
Donald Trump has always bought everything on credit, and all of a sudden, you know, at this moment in his life, in his career, as it's getting mixed up with politics, why did he start paying cash? It leads to a lot of innuendo. It leads to a lot of speculation about where did the money come from and what were his motives. And
they're not making money. And they were losing money beforehand.
That's right. I mean, as a pure investment, they don't make any sense.
Nor does the fact that the president had such an enormous amount of cash on hand.
I just did this out of cash flow, and we just have we have an absolutely zero debt property.
The president's cash flow, like his golf handicap, is hard to establish. Citing an ongoing audit, he has refused to make his tax returns public, so there's no easy way to figure out the source of his funds.
I honestly can't comment on that, because all I know is I know where the money came from. I saw the statements. I saw the invoices. I you know, settled everything. He paid all his bills on time, which in the development world is, you know, quite unusual.
So you saw it came out of his account, but would you have known how the money got in there?
No, I would not have known.
What are your sources telling you about money going into these properties? Where did the money come from?
They've been sounding alarms since the sale went through. You know, where did the money come from, and who was behind the money, and what was the purpose of it? You know, that's been a constant in these sales. And as Trump became president, you know, the drum beats got much louder.
One of the things fueling those suspicions is something respected golf reporter James Dodson says he heard from Eric Trump in 2013 when he was asked about the funding for his family's golf courses. "We don't rely on American banks," he was quoted as saying. "We have all the funding we need out of Russia." But more recently, he denied ever saying those words, calling the report fake news. The president himself has always denied taking in any Russian money. "No loans, no nothing," he tweeted.
shows your tax returns,
But
mate.
why would the president invest his own money in Turnberry?
Turnberry is a great golf course.
Are golf courses a profitable investment? Are they a good way to make money?
Almost never. Just having a club and having members is a great way to lose a fortune.
Unless it's somebody else's money.
Yeah, so someone's losing money. Yeah, I don't know who's losing money at Turnberry, but it seems like it's become kind of a black hole for money.
In addition to learning about the new charges in the Russia investigation, we also learned today from some exclusive reporting by our NBC News colleagues that the president's own military chiefs went straight into damage control mode after this week's NATO summit. The commander-in-chief had apparently warned other leaders behind closed doors that unless they increased their defense budgets, the U.S. would, quote, do our own thing. Pentagon staffers were told to get on the phone with our allies to reassure them that the president is still committed to NATO. NATO was set up to contain the threat from Russia, a threat that is still real today.
It is still the world's most powerful military alliance. Its members fight and train shoulder to shoulder. This recent show of force, codenamed Sabre Strike, took place right on Russia's doorstep. But NATO has only ever been as strong as its most important member. The United States contributes more money, more hardware, and more personnel than any of the other 28 member countries.
This display of military might is about sending a message to Russia and its increasingly nervous neighbors, a message that any attack will immediately send powerful American warships roaring into battle.
And American GIs landing on Europe's shores to defend our allies, just as they did during World War II. But for several years now, the idea that NATO was a relic designed to fight the wars of the past has been strongly argued in right-wing circles.
This is the corpse of an international institution that's become zombified. It's dead. And what you do with a zombie is you shoot it in the head.
Michael Desch teaches political science at Notre Dame.
You called NATO a zombie.
Yeah.
Why a zombie?
Well, it was a colorful metaphor to make a point.
So do you think NATO is outdated?
Yes.
It's run its course.
That's right.
That sentiment turned into a key talking point in the Trump campaign.
I have said that NATO was obsolete. And it is. It's obsolete.
NATO is obsolete. It's old. It's fat. It's sloppy.
After taking office, Trump walked back some of that language and focused instead on attacking other NATO members for not spending enough on their own defense.
NATO, you got to start paying your bills. The United States is not going to take care of everything.
The president claims to have gotten that commitment in Brussels this week.
The people have stepped up today like they've never stepped up before.
But critics say his transactional view of NATO, where you get out what you put in, is undermining the entire ethos of the alliance.
They are sworn to stand together against aggression.
When NATO was created 70 years ago, Americans made a lofty promise.
To come to the aid of any one of them who may be attacked.
Undertaking that burden is what gave American presidents the right to call themselves the leaders of the free world. But that's one title our current president has never claimed.
From now on, it's going to be America first.
Fundamentally, I think he does not see the value that NATO brings to U.S. security.
Yeah.
Mark Simakovsky helped shape U.S. policy on NATO and
If
Russia.
you leave NATO, it has to close down all the U.S. bases in Europe.
Free riding.
How do you get access to
overcommitment of US
Afghanistan,
security?
Syria,
So it's a political
Iraq,
tool that he
if
uses
you
to
can't
gain
fucking
support
have
of
bases in Europe?
Critics say
You
that
can't do it all
NATO's
from a
mission
fucking
ended with the
flap
fall
boat,
of
you
the
know what I mean?
Berlin Wall and the end of the
Laptop.
Cold War.
Your aircraft
But the
carriers
rise
can't
of
stay
Vladimir
out there
Putin
forever.
brought about
They've
a
always
new
got to
age of
fucking be
confrontation.
replaced. That's extra expense. They
4
have to
years
use
ago, I
European fucking
watched
bases.
as Russians marched into Ukraine and occupied the region of
I don't know
Crimea.
what he's thinking, man.
This is a Ukrainian military facility, but there are no supply convoys coming in and out right now because they're being blocked by these pro-Russian militiamen. They've put this place under siege, and it looks like they're going to be here for a while.
Putin got away with it. Crimea is now firmly in Russian hands. 10 years ago, when Russia invaded Georgia, NATO didn't intervene because Georgia is not a member country. Now, it's allowing the Russian war in Ukraine to rage on for the same reason. That has all of Russia's neighbors worried. In Sweden, the government wants people to be prepared for war. And that fear is spreading across Europe, even to NATO member countries. In those closest to Russia, people are joining volunteer defense forces in record numbers. And in Norway, the biggest hit on TV is a show that imagines a future under Russian occupation. Putin clearly sees a war coming, and he's getting ready for it. Still, Daesh thinks that Russia is getting a bum rap.
I'm not saying that Putin is a nice guy, but on the other hand, the United States and NATO made moves that were clearly provocative.
So you think NATO provokes Russia and makes Russia aggressive?
It takes two to tango, Richard, and I would say that we bear some responsibilities.
Responsibility because NATO has been expanding, adding new member states from Russia's former sphere of influence. Pushing NATO away, as President Trump has been doing, strikes Daesh as reasonable.
There is a feeling now that President Trump is willing to sacrifice NATO to make
These
Vladimir
are all fucking
Putin
Russian
happy.
puppets, man.
Are they right?
No, I don't think that they're right.
But to our allies in Europe, Putin's Russia poses a clear and present danger, a danger that President Trump is ignoring as he prepares for his big meeting with the Russian leader.
I don't fear
when I see
the Russian people
smiling and backslapping.
I don't dislike the American people, but
and
Trump
smiling
and Putin
and
are
shaking
fucking
hands
dangerous
with the
people,
dictator
man.
in Moscow and castigating our closest friends and our allies.
They put at
In
risk
many ways,
the
President
freedoms
Trump
and
is
democracies
actually
of the Western world
fulfilling
at the moment.
President Putin's objectives.
How?
Because President Putin would love the image of a meeting with Russia to be the dominating headline of President Trump's swing through Europe. Instead, you're going to get a headline that Trump meets with Putin and agrees to cooperate.
Mm-hmm. And nobody will know what to say because he's not allowing fucking diplomats in the room.
And thanks, Stuart Home, for joining us this hour. All right, it starts.
That's yesterday's.
Will be people turning out on the streets to demonstrate their opposition to Donald Trump's visit.
You've mentioned in the past the importance of unity. Perhaps, and I put this out there, I spoke to Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, yesterday as well, talking to him about the protests that were happening in the capital, about offering the hand of friendship, perhaps using the things you disagree on, perhaps working better to solve those in terms of unity. Is that not a higher ground to take, perhaps?
Well, I think the problem is that Donald Trump's politics are so alien to many of those things which not only the people of this country value, but I think people throughout
Russia
the world
has attacked
value.
British citizens with fucking gas.
Of,
Nerve agents,
the
mate.
American Constitution.
On with fucking inland.
The address talks about all being created equal.
That's not something that a fucking just a competitor does, man. That's an enemy.
Where's the equality in his treatment of women? So there is a fundamental problem with the political outlook of Donald Trump, which makes it very difficult
attacked
that there's
fucking
ever been a
America.
meeting of minds.
Can you shed some light on why Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, isn't meeting Donald Trump?
Well, not really. There's not much in the public domain about that, about whether there was any.
Because she's fucking got more brains than fucking me.
Personally, I don't think it would have made a lot of sense, given that the vast majority of people in Scotland are against the visit, are saying that Donald Trump is not welcome here. It wouldn't really make a lot of sense, it seems to me, for the Scottish First Minister to meet with him.
Can't keep him as a visitor,
Richard
you don't have to
Leonard,
meet
Scottish
him
Labour
as a
leader, thank you very much for talking to us this morning.
Thank you very much.
Right, it's time to find out now what's happening with the weather, and
Part of
it
the
looks
political
set
agenda,
to continue. Oh, look at that gorgeous picture. Morning, Louise.
Isn't this stunning? Good morning, everybody. Sometimes we get moaned at a little bit.
Anyway, that's the stream. That's my in real life thing. I'm going to be going and playing Fishing Planet shortly. Thank you for watching, guys. If you stopped by to have a look at what I was doing in real life on politics, I just wanted to display what was happening in Britain while Trump was here, because a lot of the people in America are just not going to see it. It's just going to be ignored. It's not a big story, the Trump meeting, although I'm certain they're going to splash all over the right wing, the meeting with the Queen, shaking hands, and the trooping the colour and all that fucking shit, you know what I mean? So Americans are going to get the total wrong idea of how his British fucking visit went, you know? So I'll be uploading this to YouTube anyway, so people can actually see what was actually going on in Britain while I was here. And I played American news feed, no sound over the images in Britain, just so that you can understand what's going on while he's meeting Putin. That Mueller is bringing forward more indictments against Russian spies, and there seems to be a tenuous connection with Trump at the moment, but who knows what Mueller's got to prove, whether these connections are solid or not. It will come more clear, I suppose, over the coming months, and if he's innocent, then so much the better for him. If he's guilty, I can't wait to see him fucking being charged, impeached or whatever, you know, or forced to resign like Nixon. But anyway, that's my in real life stream. I'll be going to Fishing Planet soon, and thanks for stopping by, guys, wherever you are, whatever you're doing. It's all went well for you. I hope you're having a lovely day up here in Scotland. Temperatures are up in the 20s again, and yeah, lovely weather. Cheers, guys. See you later.